the games industry for about 12. I worked with Brian at Firaxis, worked on Civilization and several other Sid Meier's titles. And I'm a freelancer out of Annapolis. I got exposed to VR a couple of years ago when I was visiting Jamestown, and the tour guide gave a great tour of Jamestown and pulled out a Google Cardboard to give an example of VR, and that happens to be Jeff right here. So Jeff introduced me to VR a couple of years ago, and I got hooked. And so I've been doing a combination of 360 animation renders for 360 video, and also real-time products, interactive products. So I'm going to talk, half of my discussion is going to be talking about a case study with a project I work on for the museum. They're going to release on, I think it's July 14th, a Berlin Wall exhibit as a Vive interactive exhibit, where you can be on the West Berlin side of the wall and take a sledgehammer to the wall. On the east side, you can be on an observation tower and grab the spotlight and try to catch people escaping to the west. Then you get into the East Berlin street and into a basement. You try to escape to the west. And it was a very interesting learning exhibit, learning process. I'll get into it in a second, but I'll show you a demo of my 360 videos that I've done. So this is my 360 reel.
Go for 4K, come on.
So I've got about 5 or 6 different pieces in a row. I took some animation projects that I had worked on in the past and re-render them to be spherical. Luckily with 3D animation for 360, I don't have to deal with stitching. It's just a straightforward process of rendering. So I like to do a lot of compositing and effects. The first piece is a World War I trench. So I like to use reflections a lot. So when a person's got a headset and they're looking down, they look in the water and they see planes flying over, and it encourages them to look in different directions. Each piece that I've done, I'll get that in a second. This is the Berlin Wall environment that I had modeled the environment and did some kit bashing and handed the environment to a Unity developer who implemented it in Unity and added the interactive elements. I'll talk about the research involved with the Berlin Wall. So this is sort of a surreal piece. You're going through the fences and you're trying to get across. I do a lot of experimenting with 360 rendering as to do's and don'ts of camera motion. And in this piece, originally I had the camera stop and look up at the tower and come back down. And when I tested that on a headset, breaking the horizon is the worst thing you could do for moving the camera around. So each example you'll see in the reel is testing different kinds of camera motion. In this piece here, you get a central object. You've got a Zeppelin. This is an event over London in 1917 where the first Zeppelin was shot down. So you get a central object, your camera's rotating around it, and when you have a headset on and you try to look to your right, it's sort of fighting you. So this is kind of an example of testing a central object. Again, we've got reflections. We've got a mirror here. This is a Korean War piece. And this is Berlin 1945. And this is an example of swinging the camera around and trying to get attention of the user to get behind it. My website, 3dhistory.com. So going back to the Berlin Wall piece, like I was saying, it was a very educational process of, we had released the beta, we had finished the beta in November, and the museum had a public display of the work we had done so far, and we paid attention to the people putting on the Vive headset, what they looked at, what they were interested in. And originally in the design, we had the narrative about the Berlin Wall up front. And people who put on a headset, they want to get into the interactive elements of it. And it was sort of like when you play a game for the first time, you have an intro movie, people space bar through it, they just want to get around it and get to the fun stuff. So when we redesigned it for the alpha, we spread the narrative throughout the exhibit. Now in this piece for a museum, museums, I'll also talk a bit about, I did an animation for Smithsonian Natural History. It's all about the flow of people. It's about getting the visitor's attention long enough to tell a story, to educate them a little bit, but not have them stack up. And with VR, you got to limit that experience, probably 7 minutes, and then we'll get into the logistics a bit about it. So before that, I'll show the Pinniped piece I did for Smithsonian. It's about, you walk into the Objects of Wonder exhibit at Natural History, and the first thing you see is this fossil on the wall. And the fossil, you'll see, is head left here. The head's on the left side. But as you walk in, you take a sharp right to go to the rest of the exhibit. So that what they wanted was bones coming off of the fossil and forming into a skeleton with an illustration here. And at some point, they wanted in the design that the creature is formed, but it turns to the right and it flows to the right to imply for people to keep moving in that direction. So I'll just let it play. So this is the ancestor of the seal. It's a pinniped. So we added bubbles to imply it's underwater, and it's just a looping animation that you'll see. So in these meetings with both the museum staff and the Smithsonian staff, it's interesting in how you get exhibits designers, you get media designers, and what's really important to them is to get visitors to see as much as possible, but get as much as they can out of each exhibit as they go. So with the Berlin Wall project, since a lot of people have never tried VR, we were talking about it being intuitive right off the bat. You've got a Vive, you've got 2 controllers with thumb pads and multiple buttons on each controller. How do you train somebody up front to not spend half of that 7 minutes going, what does this button do? How does this work? So we discussed different ideas for the user interface to train people, as quickly as possible. And another idea was if you could mount a monitor on the wall, if people are lining up for this, this experience, maybe have a monitor on the wall that shows a training video what the controllers do. Another idea is, do you lock off some of the buttons, sort of like giving Grandpa the remote for the cable box and taping off the buttons that he shouldn't press. This is the volume, this is the channel. And then we got into discussing if a museum has multiple exhibits or multiple applications in VR in that museum space. Do they set up, 1 or 2 or 3 Vives and have people try a sequence of different, different applications? Let's say Berlin Wall or Vietnam or whatever. Now that may cause people to stack up and wait in line for the experience. Now, if you have multiple Vive set up, if they're close to each other, the sensors can fight with each other. So when we showed the beta, Time Life was also showing their Pearl Harbor piece, and they had a lot of trouble with these 2 Vives setting up next to each other, fighting with each other. Now, take the logistics another way. If you set up a separate VR exhibit at a different VR application to match different parts of the exhibit, then you're using up, let's say, a 10-foot by 10-foot space in multiple areas in the museum. So that adds up quickly, not only in the square footage it's taking up in the museum, but also you're going to have a docent, a tech-savvy docent operating that equipment at each of these locations. So if you go from one central location with maybe 1 or 2 docents, and but then you go to 5 different locations, you get 5 different staff members, you get a pay, plus all the equipment as well. One thing we learned in the beta also, we were talking about user interface and people's height. In the original design to go from to teleport to the next location, we had just tried out a button that's sort of like a Staples red button that someone would press and go. But some people who were trying it, who were tall, it was out of their field of view. And they're like, well, what am I going to do? What do I do next? And so it was, user testing, kids, of course the button's up here, but it's very useful. So my next half of the presentation discuss historical accuracy versus artistic license. Now, I'm sure everybody's familiar with forensic animation for lawsuits. There are companies that specialize in doing animation for, let's say, accident reconstruction for aircraft or maritime or car accidents. And in the legal world, if let's say an attorney is representing somebody who's suing a few $1 million to an airline to prove they were at fault, they will often invest in creating animations to recreate that event. So forensic animation is also historic animation. You're describing an event, but really it's the artist's interpretation of that event. But in courtrooms, when juries see an animation of an event, they think it must be true because it's in 3D. This must be fact. But they're often warned in a courtroom setting that this is an artist's interpretation of the event. It may not be fully accurate, or an attorney will say, show it from this angle but not from that angle, because that may make our case fall apart. So these same concepts apply in creating animation for history, or VR applications for history. So to give an example, I always try to stress historical accuracy in my projects. I'll show an animation that I had done, and these same rules apply to doing VR as well. This is an animation on the Korean War. So these are. So this is an animation scene I had set up on a specific event in 23rd of October 1951 in the Korean War, where U.S. Air Force had sent 9 B-29 World War II era bombers on a mission over Namsi in North Korea. Now, these B-29s did wonderfully in World War II, but by the time of Korea, you had jet fighters who were much faster than these bombers. So in the end, at the end of this mission, 8 out of 9 of the bombers were either shot down or total write-offs. And after this event, the Air Force never did a daylight raid against North Korea for the rest of the war. So I wanted to create this animation on this event, and when I do a lot of research on each project, there was only one book that was published about this event, and it's called Black Tuesday over Namsi. And I reached out to the author, a retired colonel, asking him if I could ping him for certain historical details. And I tried to follow his book as best I could, but in the reality, the American F-86 Sabre fighters were not really mixing in that bomber formation. They were engaging fighters a couple of miles ahead, but I brought them in to make it more cinematic, more artistic and comprehensive, exciting animation. So I bent the historical accuracy a little bit. And when I published this animation to Vimeo, a couple months later, I got an email from Vimeo saying we locked off that video because of copyright violation. And I wrote back, I said, what do you mean copyright